In this episode, I try to create a surfboard from a single pallet. Okay, I have a single pallet here, and I already took it apart. And today I'm going to try to make a small chambered surfboard with this. It's going to be more like a bodyboard. It's going to be 3'3", so it's going to be tiny, but I want to try to make it a chambered board. So the best way to do that is go with the length of the slats, and I made it just a little bit shorter so I can hopefully fit it between the nail holes on these. But I already have my rocker template designed, and I'll be able to get 2 pieces out of each slat. And then the runners, they're a little bit thin for this, so I'm gonna have to strategically put them in the board where I'm gonna drop in a concave in the bottom. But I have very little rocker in this. There's a little bit of flip in the nose and like 1/8 of an inch in the tail. But in order to make this work with the runners, I'm gonna do a single concave through it. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out all my boards into my rough blank shape so that I can then plane them to the right thickness and glue them together. I'm going to start by tracing my paper template only once. I can then cut this piece out as close as I can, which will give me a solid template that I can then quickly trace onto the rest of the boards. I don't need to be too exact with cutting these out, as I'm going to attach them all together into a big blank, which will get planed into the final blank shape. With all the boards cut out, I can then run them through the planer to make the sides flat for gluing. I'm going to glue all the slats into pairs as the boards are thinner than the runners of the pallet. This will also help keep the slats straighter and strengthen any boards that have cracks, as well as reduce the amount of boards I need to chamber. After the wood glue dries, I'm going to screw the boards together to make my wood blank. Screws will make it easier to separate the wood when I go to chamber the board. I tried to make sure I placed the screws where I wouldn't cut into them when I cut my outline. For the final piece, I used a few drops of wood glue to make it easy to crack off the board to get at the screws. Alright, I have my blank all screwed together, and I'm gonna take the planer and just clean it up now. There's some areas I need to bring it down quite a bit, just where like the runners of the pallets were a little thinner. I've got some pretty big dips that I need to plane out. All I really wanted to do was get like a rough rocker so I knew roughly what I need to cut out of each board. But what I'll do now is take the planer and just clean it all up, and then I can cut out my outline on this. I don't typically use the planer when I'm making surfboards. I've used it once before shaping a small wood board, but it's something that's not really ideal for the space I'm in where it's so small, so I typically like to use hand tools. I also enjoy using the hand tools, but working with the wood, the planer was so much faster than if I tried to do this without it. And if you're gonna try to do a wood board, I would recommend picking up a cheap planer like this one, just so you're not having to do this all with a sander. It would just take way too long. When I glued up my blank, I made sure I put a board in the middle of it so that I could measure the center of that board and draw a line down the middle, and I'm using this line so that I can line up my template down the center of the blank. And this template is one I made with BoardCAD and printed it out. It's a little bit between like a mini Simmons and a fish. It's really just trying to maximize the amount of surface area I can get out of this blank, and just making it something that I think will be able to surf fairly well for its size. The board's all cut out. The bandsaw worked okay. It was a lot of work with just this much weight cutting out, but it cut it nice and square, so it didn't take too much to clean up the outline with the sander. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for this. So what I'm going to do now is mark out where my rail bevel is going to go, and I'm going to go with roughly a 2-inch into the board bevel, and that's just going to help this board plow through the water a little easier. And then in the middle, I'm going to give it a deep single concave to try and get rid of these low spots. So I'm going to mark that out and shape the board. The more I used the planer, the more comfortable I got with it, and I started out taking really shallow passes, but pretty quickly I was able to adjust it to take more aggressive passes. And I'm just using the planer to get close to where I want my contours to be, and then I'm going to come back in with the sander and get them exactly where I want them. When I was shaping this, I left the edge of the rail unshaped so that I can have something to clamp to, so I can squeeze the board together and get a nice tight bond with the pieces. So the other thing I did was I marked out where my fin boxes are going to go, and I'm not going to chamber those areas so that I have a nice solid block of wood to router into, and that'll make my fin boxes really strong. And I also marked out where the supports are going to go on each piece because I'm going to alternate them. It'll all be one big chamber, but it will keep things kind of almost honeycombed so that it should be nice and strong and I don't put my foot through the board. Where this is pallet wood, I don't know how strong it'll be. So what I'm going to do now is roughly draw out my chambers, and then I will drill a hole so that I can use the jigsaw to cut out the majority, and I'll go back in with the rotary tool and clean everything up. For the chambers, I'm going to try to make them as big as possible while leaving roughly a 1/4 inch on the top and bottom of the chamber, and this should give me enough wood to be able to go back in and finish cleaning up the shape when I glue it back together, while still keeping enough strength that I'm not going to put my foot through it. Where I'm not glassing this, I need to make sure it's a little beefier than if I was going to add a layer of glass. To chamber these out, I started with a drill bit, and I would drill a hole on each end of each chamber, and then I came back through with the jigsaw and cut the hole. And this turned out to be a little bit slower than I thought, and I ended up having to clean it up quite a bit. I think my drill bit was a little bit small, but I just kept working through on the first day to see how far I would get with it. The next day, I went back to doing the same process, but this time I grabbed a spade bit, which was much more aggressive, and I got a little bit of chip out on the pieces, but not much. And for how much faster this was the way to go. It made cutting the pieces so much easier, and it sped up the process a lot. I now have all the pieces hollowed out, and on the sections without the fin boxes, I think I was able to reduce the weight to almost half. And on the ones with the fin boxes, they are significantly lighter, but I left a lot of the wood so that I'd be able to get a really solid fin box. I have a set of fins I want to make for this board. If it does work, that'll require a lot of strength in the fin boxes, so I want to make sure there is the strength there for it. And on the rails, I hollowed out a fair bit, but I wanted to leave them a little bit thick so that I could go and finish shaping the rails when I finish gluing this up. So the next thing I'm going to do is put the pieces back in order, and then I'm going to glue everything up and clamp it, and then I'll be able to finish shaping this. So I'm going to jump into gluing it up. Gluing the board back together didn't go quite as smooth as I was hoping. The clamps allowed the boards to shift a millimeter or two, so I have to go back in now and sand everything smooth, which is something I figured would happen. So when I shaped the board, I left it just a little bit rough so I could come back in and sand it nice and smooth. With the board sanded, I'm now going to take some wood filler and fill in all the little nail holes, all the little cracks, everything I can. And I'm going to allow this wood putty to cure, and then I can go back and sand the board smooth again. With the deck of the board and the bottom shaped, I can now go and finish up my rails. And I'm going to continue using this sander on this with some 80 grit just so I can take it nice and slow. And once I have the rail shaped, I can give the board a final sanding. Because this board is hollow, I need to add a way to equalize the air with the temperature changes. So I'm going to add a hole that I can fill with resin and add a brass screw and O-ring, and this will allow me to vent the air. While I'm drilling this hole, I'm also going to add another hole that I can put a string through so I can attach a leash. For this board, I'm going with a twin fin set, so I'm going to add 2 future fins boxes so that I can swap out between little nubby fins and some keels. I do have an experimental set of fins I want to make for this board, if I can get this board up and surfing. Because I'm not going to glass this entire board, I want to make sure that while I'm glassing in my fin boxes, I add some fiberglass patches over top so that the boxes won't rip out. The epoxy should bond them well enough, but having the glass over top will just give me an extra safety net for using larger fins in this board. While I'm doing this, I'm also going to add my race paper logo, and I'm going to fill my leash plug, and I'm going to fill my vent with some chopped up fiber and fiberglass bubbles. Once the epoxy has cured, I'm going to sand it smooth into the board by feathering the edges, and then I will be able to give the board a nice clear coat and start sealing everything up. Alright, the board is done. It's not really a surfboard, it's more of a bodyboard, but the final weight is 8 pounds, like exactly. So I'm really excited with how this came out. It came out way better than I thought it would. So I kind of wish I used more than one pallet to make this, so I could have made it like a little bigger so there's a better chance of it surfing. But I'm going to take this out and see if I can stand up on it. Worst case scenario, I'm going to use this as a bodyboard. And it'll be pretty fun for that, especially with some little fins in it. But hopefully it's going to surf. I have high hopes that it's going to. The biggest thing is whether the clear coats sealed all the little nooks and crannies in this. But after I did some heavy coats with the foam brush, I took my spray gun and gave it like another 6 or 7 thick coats. So it should be good and sealed, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So here's some final shots of the board, and I'm going to go see if I can get some surf footage of this.